So, welcome everybody, and good afternoon. I'm really delighted to be joined today by Simon Mickleburgh, who's the grants manager of the Rufford Foundation, and we'll be finding out more about the Rufford grant program, which is fantastic. I've benefited hugely from it myself when I started my PhD, and without the support from the Rufford Foundation, definitely wouldn't have been able to do my PhD. So it's a really fantastic program that actually helps to build and continue to grow and support. You'll be finding out a lot more about the program from Simon. And if you've got any questions at all, pop them in the chat or feel free at the end of the session. We'll have an opportunity if you want to raise your hand and I'll call you to speak to Simon. Thank you very much, Simon. Appreciate your time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and nice to be able to provide a bit of background on the Rufford Foundation, what we do, a little bit about the grants program that we run, and also some thoughts and tips on things you should consider perhaps if you're considering applying to us. So just to begin with a little bit of background as to who we are. So we're a UK registered charity, and our remit is to support early career conservationists all around the world. So I'll talk a little bit more about the more specific criteria, but that's our general focus. And we've been in operation for over 25 years. So in that time, we've given away more than £30 million, over 6,500 grants, working in over 150 countries. And obviously that's going up all the time. And we run the Rufford Small Grants Program, and that currently gives away around about £2 million a year. So we're currently giving around about 300 grants a year through that program. Just to give you an idea of the spread, so as I said, it's 150 plus countries worldwide, and they're basically in what would have in past be called the developing world, but actually is now officially those not listed as advanced economies by the International Monetary Fund. But you'll see from the map here that huge geographical spread right across the Americas, Africa, Asia, into the Pacific, and one or two sort of hot spots, if you like, are countries where we've funded a lot of projects. So those are the darker colored countries there. And you'll just see we've highlighted at the bottom here the top three countries as it stands at the moment. So India with more than 670 grants, Brazil with more than 360, and Argentina with more 320. That does tend to change over time. And we're getting more applications from Africa, for example. And as you'll see from there, there's a fairly wide geographical spread throughout Africa. But there are still quite a few countries where we have very few or no grants being given. So that's an area where we're interested in trying to improve in the future. So about the eligibility. So as I said, it's early career conservationists. And our main focus really is the level of MSc, PhD students. That's typically the people who would apply. So either the students who are actually doing the studies, or we will consider people who've graduated with an MSc or a PhD up to 3 years previously. And has to be in an eligible country. So I mentioned that we've given grants in about 150 countries in the developing world. So there is actually a list of eligible countries, which is on our website. So if you need to be clear about whether you qualify for being able to apply, just go to the website and you'll be able to go down that list and see whether you're eligible or not in terms of the country. And basically, we're funding generally quite small scale projects. So these might typically be 12 to 18 months in duration. And Rufford is usually supporting a considerable proportion of the budget. So it's often 50 and sometimes 100, up to 100% of the budget. And we tend not to be keen on focusing on projects where our contribution is a very small part of the budget, maybe say 10% or 20%. We much prefer to be a major funder or totality, if you like, of the project. And it has to have some kind of nature conservation focus. And that can be quite broad. I'll go on in a minute to talk about some of the things that we support. But certainly, if you look at our website, you'll see the variety of projects that we're funding. And we tend to have a focus on threatened species. So those are the ones that are listed as threatened in the IUCN Red List. So anything that's not listed as least concern will be from consideration. But also we might be looking at habitat or ecosystem scale projects. So whether there are particular threats to certain habitats or ecosystems, mangroves or coral reefs or tropical rainforests and so on. Or it might be a particular issue. So I'll give an example here of human wildlife coexistence, conflict and coexistence actually in many cases, which is a considerable problem throughout many parts of the developing world, and we get a lot of proposals to work on that particular issue. So as Rachel said, there is more than one grant in the scheme. So we have 4 levels of funding. So we have a first Rufford Small Grant, which is up to £7,000, a second Rufford Small Grant up to £8,000, a booster grant up to £12,000, and a completion grant up to £18,000. And those run in sequence. So you would initially apply for a first Rufford Small Grant. If that all goes well, you provide the report. Then you can apply for a second grant. To apply for a booster, you have to have completed a second grant, and to apply for a completion, you have to have had a booster grant. So you complete it basically in sequence. And each funding stage has its own particular criteria. So if you're not sure, it's best to look at the guidelines on the website. It'll give you a breakdown of all the various criteria that are for the different grants. But basically, the important thing is if you want to apply for, say, the second Rufford Small Grant, then you must have submitted a report for the previous project and so on as you go down. So if you don't submit a report for any of the projects that funded, you can't then apply for subsequent funding. So it's important that if you are given a grant, that you do provide a report at the end of it, so you can reapply for support if you want to. As I said, we have the website. Basically, it's where you apply. So all the applications are done online. There's no deadline, so you can apply whenever you wish. And you'll see just background on the website. So it'll give you information on how to apply, the different grants available. You'll also see that there is information on general criteria, explaining different sort of elements of the program. There's a series of frequently asked questions. That's also in different languages. So if your English is not your first language and you prefer to just check something in a different language, it's available in different languages. Though having said that, the application itself has to be in English. But having said that, there are good translation tools available these days, so that can certainly help you with making your application. But basically, everything has to be done online. So if you're thinking about making an application, some general guidance before you get going, before you start. And the first most important thing, and this goes for every funder, not just the Rufford Foundation, do read the guidelines and make sure that you're actually eligible to apply for whatever type of funding it is. So in our case, it's early career conservationists. So if, for example, you've in a well-established conservation career, maybe you've been doing that job for 15 or 20 years, you wouldn't be eligible to apply for a Rufford Small Grant. You'd be looking at other funders. But as I said, this goes for every funder. Worth checking the guidelines. Otherwise, it can be a complete waste of time for you. Complete the form if actually you're not eligible to apply in the first place. And when you're completing the actual form itself, I mean, most times, and we have that system where you can download the questions, so you can have a look at what the questions are, formulate those in your mind before you actually make an application. And it's always a good idea to answer all of the questions. And if you don't think any of them particularly apply, then explain why you don't think that particular question might apply to you. But if there are gaps and you haven't answered the questions, then that reduces your risk of being supported. And it's always good to ask for help. So if you've got colleagues or supervisor maybe who can advise. So as I said, it's a good idea maybe to draft questions in advance, show them to a friend, a colleague, a supervisor who might be able to advise on whether they think that's suitable for the application. And a good idea to proofread it as well before you make your application. But overall, I would say the important thing about making the application is do take your time over it. It's worth spending a bit of time thinking about answering the questions to the best of your ability and gaining advice and guidance from other people before you do it. And our form, and a lot of forms will be the same. They'll ask you to provide some information about yourself, what your plans are for the future. And this is a good opportunity for you to showcase yourself, if you like, because it's very competitive out there. There's a lot of people applying for grants. The chances of actually receiving grants are not high, so you have an opportunity there to promote yourself, to explain why you think you're the right person to do that particular work, what kind of experience you have. Maybe you've got information on social media that you can share with people, but that will all help in terms of your application. And again, when you're making an application, in our case, and probably in most funders' cases, the budget is one of the most important elements in your proposal. So it's worth spending some time thinking carefully about your budget. And these are just one or two things to think about when you're doing that. And I always believe that it's probably better to provide too much information than too little. And particularly when it comes to costings. So I'll give an example here. The two examples of, saying, oh, I'll get some camera traps and it'll cost £450, but actually providing some detail on what type of camera traps, how many camera traps you might need, then that's all very useful. And that will go for all of the elements you put into your budget. It's a good idea to be able to break down the figures that you provide. So rather than just giving one lump sum for what activity you want to do, it's good to be able to break that down so that people reviewing the proposal will be able to see how you've actually made those calculations. It's one of the things that can be a negative if we see a budget where we think simply the figures have been rounded up. You're going to do a workshop, it'll cost £1,000, but you don't know where that figure has come from and how it's been calculated. And that goes for all the elements in the budget. So the more detail, the better. And I think it's better to try and cost it out in local currency and then translate it into whatever the currency is for the application. So in our case, it's pound sterling, but it might be in dollars, it might be in euros, it might be in some other currency. And the important thing is to make sure that whatever you put in the budget, it does match what you plan to do. So it would be not good to see an activity, for example, mentioned in your proposal, but there's nothing in the budget to actually cover that. Or you've mentioned something in the budget that you costed, but there is nothing in the activities related to that. So make sure the two do match up. And we only give to organizations, we don't give to individuals. So you'll need to find an organization to accept the funds on your behalf. And most of those organizations will probably charge a fee for doing that. So in our case, we allow a maximum overhead of 10% of the total budget. But that might vary from funder to funder. And ideally, we'd prefer that to be waived completely if possible, because obviously the amounts of money we're giving are relatively small. And if we're having to give a lot of money to cover overheads, that reduces the amount available for the project itself. And there are certain things we won't fund. So these are just some of the items. But again, look at the guidelines. But the publication costs, costs of attending conferences, international flights, those are typical things we won't support. But as I said, check the guidelines before you make an application. And referees are very important. We ask for 3 referees. So it's important that you contact your referees in advance, make sure you have their permission to use them as referees. We have an automated system, so when you apply, an automatic email will go to your referees and they'll be asked to submit references on your behalf, which will then be matched up to your application. And they have 12 weeks to do that. And until they do that, we won't review the application. And when you're thinking of referees, if you're doing an MSc PhD, we ask that one of those referees is your supervisor, and one of those referees is from outside of the country. And when you're talking to referees, the important thing is it's good to provide information about you, what you're planning to do. I mean, choose referees who know you well, who can actually comment on your capabilities rather than people who perhaps have never met you and can't really comment on your suitability for undertaking the work. But don't be tempted to write references for referees to sign. That's something that will definitely work against you if we think that basically you've written the reference and the referee has simply added their signature at the end. But as I said, they have 12 weeks to submit, and if after 12 weeks they haven't submitted, then the application will be rejected. You can reapply within a year, so it's worth making sure that the referees have submitted their reference in time, and that's your responsibility to do that. And as I said, we give to organisations. Often that's a local NGO or perhaps a university. And again, we don't pay to individuals. So it's important before you start is to find a suitable organisation who've agreed to accept the funds on your behalf. So just some sort of tips on designing a good project. And I stressed right at the very beginning that because we're dealing with early career conservationists, we understand that this is something that perhaps they're not very familiar with. So we're not expecting incredibly detailed, incredibly effective work at that stage. We understand that we're dealing with people who don't have often a lot of experience of undertaking this work. So we understand that, and we try and recommend that if can, try to write as clearly, as concisely as you can, and try and avoid using jargon words or acronyms. I mean, we always suggest that when you're writing the proposal, just write it in the form that you assume that the person reading has no idea what you're doing at all. So there's no point in introducing terms or acronyms which they may be totally unfamiliar with. So best to try and avoid that if you can. Have some clear conservation outcomes. When you're filling in the form, it will give you an opportunity to say what your basic outcomes will be. And it's better to do a fewer outcomes and ensure that you do them well rather than have a whole string of outcomes which may not be achievable in the time available to you, bearing in mind the projects are usually 12 to 18 months in duration. So it's worth thinking about things that, are these things that you can actually achieve within that timescale. There are certain things that simply will take much longer than that to do. So worth thinking about when you're doing your outcomes to look at, can I actually achieve this? And it's better to under promise and over deliver is our sort of term that it's worth thinking about. We'll look at whether you're involving all the relevant stakeholders in the project that you're undertaking. So often that might be local government officials, perhaps, might be local communities, might be fishing communities, farming communities. And there may be a lot of stakeholders, so you might need to do a stakeholder analysis before you actually start the project. But we'll be looking at are the key people who you're trying to influence, are they actually involved? And are they involved right from the beginning? With communities, are you actually involving them right at the start of the project so they have a genuine say in what happens? And we ask about measuring impact. And again, this is not something that I would get too concerned about. We don't expect in 12 to 18 months for you to be able to demonstrate a massive change. But we will ask you to provide some indicators on how you think you'll measure what impact you're having. So if you want to perhaps decrease the number of cases of human wildlife conflict, we'd like to know, well, what would you consider a success in that sense? If you're decreasing the number of conflict situations. So some ideas on some ways in which you could measure that. But again, we're not expecting miracles in 12 to 18 months. And then do you have the necessary experience? So we don't expect one person to have all the necessary experience to undertake all the variety of work that they might want to do. So in many cases, you might be dealing with communities that might involve needing somebody with social studies skills, for example, or perhaps you're doing modeling, perhaps you might need somebody who's familiar with that. So if you're undertaking a number of different activities will be looking at you, and people in the team are the people there who have the necessary expertise to do that. And if you don't have it, then it's worth thinking about, I need to find somebody who can help with that particular element. I go back to don't be too ambitious. So again, it's better to do a few things and do them well, rather than attempt to do many things, and perhaps don't achieve any of them. And going back to the clear detail budget, is an important element, certainly. So stress again, 12 to 18 months. What can you sensibly achieve in 12 to 18 months? There might be things that I mentioned here about alternative livelihoods or maybe protected areas. Some of these can take many years to achieve. You can have plans to do that over a number of years, and you can apply for Rufford funding to do that in the future. But in terms of the current project, you've got to think, well, what can I actually sensibly achieve in 12 to 18 months? And again, emphasize that we don't expect a massive impact, but some ways in which you can measure it are useful in terms of designing the project. So when you're starting, it's always very good to think very clearly about what are the problems you're trying to tackle and devise questions that will enable you to address those issues. So think very clearly about what is the issue? What is the issue you're trying to deal with, and how do you actually design something to help you in actually tackling that issue? And there's information available. I mean, the Conservation Leadership Program, for example, is very useful. They have a number of things on their website which are very helpful to help you sort of design questions to answer those fundamental issues you're trying to deal with. And again, going back to the outcomes, what do you want to achieve within those outcomes, and how long is it likely to take? Is it something you can do, or is it something that's going to take a lot longer than one project? And perhaps there are constraints on when your activities can take place. Perhaps there are certain seasons of the year which has an impact perhaps on the species that you're studying. Maybe there are wet seasons, maybe there are dry seasons which impact different times of year. So think about that. Are you actually dealing with that? Are you being able to deal with the fact that maybe a species isn't there at certain times of year, or is much more difficult to find at certain times of year than others? Or maybe there are certain times of year, perhaps when communities are easier to deal with or talk to than at other times. So these are sorts of things that you think about on when you might be able to do the work. And again, going back to the stakeholders, thinking about who are the stakeholders who are involved. Who do I need to contact in advance? How long might that take to do that? That's all part of good project design. And at the end, I mentioned conservation evidence, which is a website you can look at, and that will give you some guidance on has the kind of work you're planning to do, has that been done before? And if it has it been successful? Or has it been perhaps not successful? And what were the issues? If it wasn't successful, what were the issues that need to be considered? And this is useful if you're designing your own project, to see whether other people have tried it and perhaps come across issues which you need to think about when you're designing your own project. As I said, indicators. Each of your outcomes will ask about activities and will ask about indicators. So try to be as specific as you can. As I said, if you're trying to, do a particular thing or measure particular things, try and find something you can actually easily measure in terms of numbers or percentages or percentage decrease or percentage increase, and think about what is it that you're actually aiming for in that time available. So there, for example, I've mentioned about conflict events. So if you want to reduce conflict events, well, by what percentage are you reducing conflict events? Are you hoping maybe 5%, 15%, 100% perhaps? I mean, that would be challenging to do. But so if you're thinking about indicators, then try and think about putting some numbers or figures into those indicators. And again, I talk about people reaching awareness raising. I mean, a lot of people will say they want to do a lot of awareness raising, but it'd be a good idea to think, well, how many people would you consider it a success, and how are you going to measure whether what you're doing in terms of awareness raising is actually having an impact in terms of what they themselves might do? And we can provide some guidance as well on how you can evaluate the success of the project as a whole. Because when you fill in your final report, we'll ask you for some questions about trying to evaluate whether the project was a success or not. So if you're successful, great, brilliant. It's tough out there. It's very a lot of people searching for not very much money. So if you've got a grant, that's great news and congratulations. So you'll receive an offer letter and we'll send you a banking information form. So as I said, well, it can only um, transfer funds to organisations. So you need to make sure that you provide the correct information on that form. We need to do verbal checks with the relevant person before we can do the transfer. So we need the information of who's the relevant person we need to talk to before we can actually transfer the funds. But it's important to get that information right. It's very frustrating to try and transfer a grant to you and it's been sent back because the information is incorrect. So make sure that that is correct when you're actually sending the banking information form back. If things go wrong, and often things do go wrong, particularly with projects at the early stages of people's careers, things will happen that are not expected at all. And that's quite normal. So don't panic if suddenly something doesn't go the way you expected. I would say probably looking through all the grant applications I've looked at, probably 98, 99% of grants, something happened that wasn't expected. And so you have to perhaps think again about an approach. It might be things beyond your control, perhaps, weather situations, unexpected weather, perhaps sudden political events, political changes, but just events that you weren't planning, weren't thinking might happen. This is all part and parcel of undertaking a project. Now, if something happens that, you know, causes you a serious issue, and you have to start to rethink about whether you can continue to do the project in the way you expected, or maybe suddenly you've got to think about, well, actually, do I need to move the funding around to take note of the changes that have happened? It's important that you discuss that with us before making any decisions. It's tempting just to simply go ahead and do things, but it's vital that if you're coming up against a problem which is going to have a significant impact on what you're doing, or perhaps is going to have a major impact on your budgeting, then do talk to us first, and we'll discuss what the options might be before going ahead and doing it. And then you'll have as I said, I mentioned a report, an evaluation report at the end. So there, one of the questions we ask is, what didn't go according to plan and what actions you take to deal with that. And majority of people fill that in. It's very rare for a project to actually say, or an applicant say, well, actually, everything went perfectly and there were no problems at all. So that's an opportunity, and it's a good opportunity to be honest about where things didn't work. And we embrace failure at Rufford. We understand that failure is part and parcel of project design and implementation, and it's how you learn from it and how other people learn from it that is the value experience. So it might be that you've tried some particular technique that perhaps worked elsewhere but didn't work where you were, and there are good reasons for that. So that kind of information is very helpful, both for you in the future and also for others who might be thinking about perhaps doing something similar. So I mentioned there, negative is just important positive. So if you tried something and it didn't work, it's important to be able to report that and say why it didn't work. So I gave an example there that you might undertake an intensive survey, particular species, but you couldn't find anything. So you didn't record it. Well, that's not negative because it shows you that perhaps the species is extremely rare, so difficult to find, or maybe the method you used wasn't appropriate for that species. So that kind of information is very valuable for both you in the future and others in the future. How are you going to actually share the results once you've finished? Now, I've talked there about journals, and that's one element that people like to try and aim to publish in, and I've ideally through open access journals as well, because that makes it easier for other people to be able to access your information. But also think about what information you need to provide back to any stakeholders. Maybe it be management authorities, maybe in local communities, might be fishing communities. What sort of information would be useful to them, and make sure you do it. Particularly if you've involved, say, local communities, there's nothing more frustrating than them never hearing from you again and not knowing what the result of the project was. So it's important that you pass that information on in a whatever the suitable format is for them. And just a few guidance on keeping funders happy. This is both for Rufford and other funders, I would say. Always say thank you if you receive a grant from them. Something quite simple, but we all appreciate you saying thank you for the support. Make sure you read the guidelines, particularly do with reporting. I always always submit reports on time. There is, again, nothing more frustrating than having to chase people for final reports. And in the case of Rufford, if you don't submit a final report, then you won't be eligible for further funding. By all means, publicise our support. Different funders may have different ideas on that, but certainly from us, we're happy for it to be publicised in terms of the support. As I've said, contact us if there are some changes that you need to make, which are significant to the project. Make sure you ask us in advance. Keep good records and receipts, because we may come back to you and ask for information on that. You need to provide a final budget for the project, so we might ask you about that. So it's important to have the records and receipts available. And share good news. If you've got any particular interesting things that have come up, by all means share that information with us. We're always pleased to do that, and may publicise it on our website if we think it's good information in that sense. And when the project is finished, don't be afraid to ask for any further funding. We have a phrase: don't ask, don't get. So don't feel afraid. The worst is we can say no, but if you don't ask for it, then you're not going to get it. So it's always the case with every funder. And if you're not successful, and I would say that that's very common. And unfortunately, as I said, there's a lot of people competing for a fairly small amount of money. So it's probably likely that everybody is going to suffer from a rejection at some point in their conservation careers. That's just the nature of life as it is in terms of funding. So it isn't the end of the world. So try not to get too upset. As I said, funds are limited. There are many reasons why funders might not have funded you, and it may simply be because they don't have the money available at the time. So it doesn't mean that that's the end of your relationship with that potential funder. For us, for example, you can reapply after 12 months. We'll provide some feedback to you, so you can act on that feedback and consider a reapplication in the future. I would suggest it's not a particularly good idea to question funders' decisions. There are all sorts of reasons why they make decisions, and all of them are done carefully. Your application will be reviewed carefully, and that decision will be made carefully. So it isn't a good idea to go back and question that decision and ask for an application to be reconsidered, because certainly with Rufford, that's not going to happen. So better to think about the feedback you've had and then work on that and think about a reapplication. And it's a valuable experience because it's made you think about your project. It's made you put down on paper your ideas, your thoughts about what you want to try and achieve and how you're going to achieve it. So that kind of information certainly will be useful for you if you apply to Rufford or maybe to another funder in the future. So hopefully that's been useful. If you have any questions, then I'll be happy to try and answer them. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Simon. Yes, if anybody wants to raise their hand or pop a question in the chat. In the meanwhile, I have a question to be asked about do you have any advice or more details on the eligibility of the NGOs that students can approach as the grant managing institute instead of universities? Because sometimes, universities can be a little bit difficult. Certainly, I know with the overhead costs and
Yeah,
things like that.
yeah,
So yeah, just is there any kind of Rufford
yeah.
criteria for NGOs?
The basic criteria is they should work in the conservation sector. So they should have some kind of conservation background, if you like. They don't have to be based in the country where you're working. They can be based in another country. It's not unusual, for example, for us to be asked to channel funds through an NGO in the UK or the US or Australia for work, perhaps in Africa or Asia or Latin America or whatever. So there are no restrictions. You don't have to work for the organization. Um, it's good if you've got some kind of relationship with them, so you know them. And we will ask, what is that relationship? How do you sort of know of that organization? But other than that, no. I mean, it's as long as they're a charitable organization. I mean, if you're not sure, you can always ask us. If you found an organization and you're not sure whether they would be suitable or not, you can always ask us. But generally speaking, as long as they work in the conservation sector,
Yeah,
that's fine. And I understand with the university element that overheads particularly can be a real problem. So yes, if you can find an NGO, that might be easier. Just depends on your situation.
perfect. Thank you very much. Tyonga, so you've got your hand raised if you want to come in.
Hi, Simon. Thank you very much for that thorough um, uh, explanation on the criteria for applying for the Rufford Foundation. Thank you very much. So my question is, I wanted to, on the guidelines, there's where you fund, where the foundation funds only threatened species. So I wanted to find out, there's some species that are listed as least concern on the IUCN, maybe because they haven't been assessed in over a period of time, but the population trend is decreasing, and also considering other sub criteria, they might be endangered because there's no specific targeted conservation efforts towards them. So does do they could they also be an exception in terms of if you have a project idea regarding those particular species that are listed as least concern, but having that decline in population. But yeah, I wanted to find out
Yeah.
how that can be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, the reason we do that is because obviously we have to limit it in some ways because otherwise it would be, thousands of species that people will apply to work. But I take the point. And if it's a least concerned species, there are one or two exceptions, if you like. Excuse me. I mean, we for example will consider um, whale species, which are very widespread throughout the world, but congregate in certain areas for breeding, which makes them quite vulnerable. So I think if you're keen to do work on a least concerned species and you feel that there's a good reason for it to be considered, you can say, well, okay, it's least concern, but there's good evidence that it's declining rapidly, or maybe there's you know, a suggestion that criterion is needs to be reassessed because that does happen. So certain species, people feel that it's necessary to do a reassessment because they feel there's good evidence to suggest that maybe they're not actually least concerned. They may be slipping towards near threatened or vulnerable. So ideally, it should still be on a species that's listed as threatened, but there is an option if you like, if you can argue. But then it's up to the trustees to decide whether they feel that that's a good enough argument to support it or not. So I don't know whether that answers the question,
Uh,
but it's
sure, thank you.
it's just really
That's
providing some evidence if you like.
yes, yes, it does answer. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess, like you'd said before, you're also, I guess, when applications are coming in, you're comparing them across
Mm,
different, projects. And if you've got a, highly threatened species and there's
mm,
there's documented evidence, compared to a least concern where there might be some anecdotal evidence, it's a
mm.
bit harder. But yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so we've got a question here on, actually got a few questions coming in, which is great. Can the budget include payment of individuals?
Yeah, this is an interesting point because the grants are quite small. So people often ask us, can we fund salaries? Generally not, because really the budget, it's not sufficient really to be able to do that with a lot of the grants. But having said that, we will cover general subsistence costs. So we will cover accommodation costs, we'll cover food costs, we'll cover travel costs. You may need to, employ local people to assist you with work, doing the work. Yes, it's fine to provide, some repayments to them. We don't expect people to work for nothing. But in terms of sort of general salaries as such, not really. But we'll cover most of the other general costs that you would incur doing the project, hopefully.
Great. And then is there an age limit for the application? So I suppose if somebody was a mature student who'd done their master's or PhD later on, do you have any advice?
We don't as such. I mean, first of all, we understand that educational systems vary from country to country. So unlike, say, the UK, where people might be doing PhDs at the age of 20 or 21, for example, in other countries, it might be much later in life when they're able to do that. And you're quite right that people might have done a completely different career and then moved into conservation later on, and that's acceptable. What we're trying to avoid really is people who have been already in the conservation sector for maybe 10 or 15 years doing work, because then we couldn't really argue that they're early career conservationists. But age in itself is not actually necessarily related to that. But having said that, sometimes we'll get applications from people who've worked in the conservation sector for 20 years and then decided to do a PhD and then apply to Rufford and say, well, I'm doing a PhD. But we would say, well, yes, but you're not early career. So age, not really, no.
No, okay. And I suppose a question leading on from that was sort of saying early career limitation to kind of 3 years. Would you consider applications after that, after the 3 years post master's or PhD?
It's like all these things. I mean, it's not hard and fast, but if you apply, then your chances are not as great as if you're within that 3-year window. That's our main focus, really. I mean, I will say that we also will consider people who have got something like a BSc or equivalent and not yet moved to an MSc or PhD. We might consider them if they're still early career, but they're not our priority. So it would have to be a really good project for us to, fund it. So, yeah.
Perfect. Okay. And then there's a question on organization. So can an organization without a website be considered, but that is a registered NGO?
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I mean, we understand that like a lot of smaller organizations work perhaps on Facebook as opposed to a website. There's not an issue with that, as long as you can provide evidence that they are formally established within the country. So that's what we would ask for, is some piece of information that shows you are a formally established body within that country. You don't have to have a website. But just some evidence so that I mean, as I said, often it's a Facebook page that we could look at. Yeah.
And I suppose this is kind of leading on from the same person, but it's just saying, what about a registered environmental sensitive cooperative eligible for funding? So I'm not sure what.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there are different terms for different things. I think that one we'd have to look at. We'd have to look at. We'd have to be, we'd have to confirm that we were happy with that. I don't think there would be a problem, but I know there are different terms for, certain types of organisations. But provided, I guess, it's charitable, not for profit, and it's within the environmental sector, then that shouldn't be an issue.
Or as Simon said, the other option, if that's not suitable, you could maybe look for an alternative, but have a chat to Rufford about that.
Yeah. I mean, we can always sort of, if you say, well, I'm actually interested in using this organisation, what do you think? We will, we're quite happy to look at that and give you guidance on that. Yeah.
Excellent. I know lots of people have come and gotten us advice as well, so it's always good, like you say, to have that conversation and build up that. So we've got another question is, this is in the form of a question around the sort of beneficial species or habitats as such. If the project focuses on overall species of a taxa, for example, amphibians or bats, and so the question is based on that it may keep negative indication during selection process because it's not a particular species. So it's kind of, yeah, would it be a problem if it's a kind of an overall
No,
taxa rather than a
no,
species group?
no. It's as I said, our remit is broad, so we're not. I mean, we mention about species, but it doesn't mean that all of our projects have to be on species. They can be on broader groups. They don't have to be on individual species. So, you might decide that as I said, want to do a general survey of amphibians in a particular area, or you want to do a general survey of bats in a particular area because there's little information available, and you want to generate perhaps some management guidance or whatever. So it doesn't have to be focused on particular species. In some cases, there's no species focus at all. It might be more generally on a specific habitat or on a specific issue. It might be on human-wildlife conflict and coexistence, but on a whole range of species. We don't know. So yeah.
Excellent, great. And then we've got our last question so far is, by any chance, do you offer feedback on applications to help improve the next round of applications? So I know you did say that you do provide, and I know that there's been some really
Yeah,
helpful.
we basically have a two-stage process. So stage one is the application is reviewed within the Rufford office. And there we're really simply looking at our basic criteria, and these are the ones listed on the website. Is it an eligible country? Are you an early career conservationist? These kinds of basic broad questions we're asking to see whether you fit those broad categories to begin with. And if you get rejected at that stage, we will basically tell you don't meet one of those criteria. Won't necessarily which one, but we'll tell you that you haven't basically met one of the basic criteria for support. If we consider that you are, you have passed that test of meeting the criteria, and we think it's worth a further review, it goes to an external reviewer. So we use Fauna and Flora, so international conservation charity based in Cambridge, and they do our external reviews for us. So it'll go for external review. They will raise a number of points, a number of questions. It'll come back to the Rufford office. And most of the time, if we think it's worth considering further, those questions will go to the applicant. And most of the times, actually, when they get to the stage and they come back to us, a lot of the people get funded, but not everybody. But if we feel that they're not suitable for support after being reviewed, then we'll give feedback. So we'll, using the questions and issues that Fauna and Flora has raised, we'll generate feedback, which will be more specific, talk about the areas where we felt there were concerns about the project and things that would need to be looked at if you were considering a reapplication in the future. So yes, there are different types of feedback, but you will certainly get some feedback, yes.
Yeah, and the feedback I know other people have had has been really helpful. And I know during my PhD, I had an opportunity to have those questions and got a chance to answer and send that back. And I think it was really very unusual for funders to give you that opportunity to answer further questions. I think that's a really was a great opportunity, and also got us, thinking about how we'd framed things.
That's the
and
point,
we
really.
hadn't explained it, fully.
Yeah. So, for example, if we ask questions and you provided the answers and then we rejected the proposal, then it should be clear from the questions we were asking where the issues lay. So, we would probably have decided that we weren't happy with the responses that you gave to those questions. So we didn't feel that you addressed all of those issues fully. So if you have had questions raised and then you get rejected, then you need to look back at those questions and think more carefully about, these are obviously the areas that Rufford felt were issues that I need to think about.
Yeah,
when I'm
it was really great for us because we got ours was accepted, but it might have been rejected had we not had a chance to answer, so that was actually quite nice. And like you say, it's really good learning.
Yeah.
So just to say, I actually in the chat I've popped in the Rufford Foundation's application link, and also as Simon had said, the conservation evidence.
Yeah.
That's really good to look at if you haven't already. It's fantastic. And it's really great that actually it was through Rufford we found out about it. So it's got some really good information, and it's growing all the time, and they're really keen for info from around the world. So Tayonga, I noticed you had your hand up again, so I just wanted to double check if that was a legacy hand, but I've got a couple more questions as well. So if you want to, Tayonga, did you want to come in?
Oh, yes, I did. I just had one last question. I wanted to find out, how does the foundation view a project that would want to specifically focus on a policy or advocacy um, approach, where there's a certain particular law or maybe certain actions that can only be addressed if those laws are implemented? So if, let's say, you put in a proposal, or you put in an application for the grant, and most of the budget is allocated to engaging with the stakeholders, as well as the law enforcement and other people that are in charge of ensuring that those laws can be passed. How does the foundation view such type of projects that would want to influence policy that can influence ultimately influence the conservation outcomes you wish to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're happy to consider that kind of approach if it's thought to be necessary for that situation, where perhaps there is, as you say, maybe a lack of enforcement, or there needs more work doing on that particular element. As I said, there's no one type of project that Rufford will fund. They're all different in terms of their approaches. So in some cases, it might be very on the ground conservation activities. In some cases, it might be more to deal with trying to develop policy issues or dealing with management authorities. So it's a slightly different approach to perhaps something very specific about, I don't know, artificial nest boxes or building fences to deal with human wildlife conflict. So I don't think there's any one project that's a typical Rufford project. So if it's a case in that situation where there's more required on the enforcement side, then yeah, that would be considered. Yeah.
Brilliant. So we have what was a comment and then a bit of a question. So somebody was just saying in their region there aren't any conservation NGOs, but Simon did say you can collaborate. It doesn't have to be within your country before, but they would like to know to establish an NGO and start this project. So the question, will funds be provided to establish an NGO? I remember you saying that there was no salary-based funding.
Yeah.
What if we remove the salary concept and just put in for the NGO and the project to work on conservation?
Yeah, we don't fund actually supporting the establishment of NGOs, unfortunately. So that's something that either would have to be undertaken by the applicant along with others, or as I said, if you're finding it challenging to find a suitable NGO, then try perhaps reaching out to others in other countries who might be able to assist. So, but we can't. The Rufford Small Grants Program isn't focused on establishing NGOs. No, it's focused on directly on conservation activities.
Yeah, and really supporting those early careers and
Yeah.
building them
Yeah.
up very much so. And so here's a really good question as well. Is co-funding considered an advantage or necessary?
Okay. At the first stage of the project, we don't expect co-funding to be in place. And in fact, for the first and second stages, great if you've got it, fantastic. But it's not an absolute requirement. But certainly as you get further along, so for booster applications and completion applications, yes, we would expect co-funding, because by the end of the process, if for sake of argument, you're applying for a completion grant, you've had 3 grants already, you want a 4th grant from Rufford, we want some good evidence this project is going to carry on beyond Rufford support. So that is often reliant on co-funding. So it's important, once you perhaps get beyond the stage of a second small grant, you need to be thinking about who else can I bring in terms of funders for this particular project to ensure it carries on into the future. And I should also stress what we mean by co-funding. It is actual money. I mean, some people put in co-funding where it's actually provision of services. So somebody's agreed to provide you something free of charge. That's not actual co-funding. So when you're putting the budget together for co-funding, it needs to be actual money. And other people said, well, I've got some bat detectors I used from the previous project, and I'm adding those into the budget. That again is not co-funding. It's an in-kind contribution, basically. So you need to be clear about what's actual money in terms of co-funding, what might be an in-kind contribution, which are great or important in their own ways, but they're not co-funding.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So there was just a quick question on, could somebody apply for 2 grants at the same time? But I just sort of said, no, it's on an individual. So it needs to be, and then somebody else was just asking about if there was good examples on the website. So I've just said there's lots of great examples, but I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add to either of those questions.
I mean, each whenever somebody gets a grant, they get their own web page. So you can go to the web page and you can see the project information about the project, updates, final reports are all there. So if you want to get a flavour of the sorts of work we support, then the website is there and it's got all the information. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's lots of really exciting, fantastic projects, and also there's lots of showcasing as well, the projects as well. So
We've done that more. Yeah,
Rufford.
we've started to do that a little bit more recently of actually showcasing some real sort of stars, if you like, of people we've supported who've gone on to achieve much greater things. So that's a nice example for people to be able to see, as to think about, well, this is something perhaps I could achieve in the future. So it's nice to see that.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and I will be sharing the recording with you all. And a huge thank you to Rufford for your time today, and to the Rufford Foundation for all the support for all this great conservation work around the world.
Okay, thank you again. Okay, nice to meet you all. Okay, bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.